Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Kupyansk, and in this one there are several developments in favor of the Russians across the front line, where the Russians have made several breakthroughs across the front in the northern section near Kupyansk and the eastern section west of Toretsk, as well as to the west of Pokrovsk. There are several additional advances across the front line, mainly in the Donetsk region. Starting out in the north, the Russians have managed to capture the town of Holyobivka, and have managed to capture several fortified positions near Radkivka, as fighting takes place in the first lines and first patch north of the town. The Russians are working on gaining control of the remaining part of Kindrashivka, as well as the fortified positions here northwest of Radkivka. The first patches around Radkivka along the highway leading into Kupyansk from the north, while the capture of Holyobivka opens the road for the Russian forces to start fighting with fortifications to the northeast of the town, where the Russians will look to storm the town of Kupyansk from the town of Kindrashivka in the northwest, all the way to Holyobivka in the east, reaching the northern parts of the settlement. This, combined with recent Russian activation of forces here west of Sinkivka along the first patch area, can lead to a direct offensive on Kupyansk from the northern flank of the town. The Russians do not have the flanks secure yet in the northern section of the front line leading into the town of Kupyansk. This means that the Russians are unlikely to launch this push towards Kupyansk yet, but will rather focus on the flanks first. This, however, does not mean that the Russians will not enter Kupyansk. Instead, the Russians will look to gain a foothold and entrench themselves within that foothold in the northern parts of the town and build up supplies within it for future offensive operations taking place within the town. In the meantime, to look to cut off the remaining supply roads in the northwestern and western directions. Moving on to the Donetsk region, the Russians have made several advances. Starting out in the Toretsk direction, there is this geolocated footage in the northern flank of Novospassky, where we see that the Russian forces were present within the northern parts of the town, and this was approximately 1 week ago. There are several ways the Russians could have reached this point. It is not clear which direction they arrived from. The most likely one is that the Russians have captured the fortifications here northwest of Toretsk and entered from the northern flank. Additional possibilities are a push from the western flank, southern flanks, or the eastern flank, all of which, through capture of Ukrainian positions, could lead to Russian forces entering the northern parts of the town. However, the most direct route would be from the east, from the city itself, which would require a Russian capture of the fortifications here in the first patch areas, which indicates the Russians have captured the fortifications and have entered Novospassky from the rear, while fighting continues with the industrial area in the north and the settlements, as well as fortifications on the northwestern flank. Potentially Russian push towards fortifications northwest of Novospassky to enter and flank the town from the rear. In either case, the Russians are moving towards the encirclement, where following the capture of the physical blocking of the road and the western flank and the operational encirclement of the northern flank, the Ukrainians have now been operationally encircled for over a week, which means it is starting to take its toll on the Ukrainian forces. If the Ukrainians run out of FPV drones or run out of artillery shells for this front line, then the Russians will be able to quickly capture what remains south of the reservoir, leading up to an open road towards Pleshivka and Ivanopilya. The Russians have a strong supply line leading into the city of Toretsk itself, which means that would likely be the center of its operations. However, they also have direct roads from the city of Donetsk towards Toretsk from the south and through Avdiivka from the west, which all lead to this pocket, where the Russian forces have a large concentration of forces to keep this pocket closed and continue their push into Kostiantynivka from the south. The Russians also managed to advance in the direction of Novotoretsk, where the Russians have managed to push from the eastern direction, gaining control over the fortifications and parts of the Dragon Teeth Alliance. Leading up to the north of Kchev, we see that the Ukrainians have a Dragon Teeth anti-tank ditch line here to the east of Toretsk The Russians are looking to bypass it by advancing along the road itself, and with control of the fortification here, have managed to reach the fortifications south of Toretsk, where Russian infantry are fighting over the fortifications to the south of the anti-tank ditch, and they are launching armored assaults in the northern flank of this anti-tank ditch. While an attempt by the Russian forces to cross over the western flank of Kchev has also been attempted, but has so far been unsuccessful. Russians are here looking to gain control over Toretsk, which will open the road for the battle over the defensive line here in between Pokrovsk and Toretsk. The Ukrainians have several fortified lines and fortifications in this section of the front line, which makes additional advances difficult, which has resulted in the Russian advances in this area slowing down following their massive advances they made last month, especially around Popivya, Poltavka, and Rusin, where fighting takes place over the fortifications, and the Russians are looking to make crossings over the anti-tank ditches and Dragon's Teeth for future pushes towards Rusin. However, the Ukrainians are not withdrawing from it, as they have nowhere to withdraw to. Instead, they are stuck in these fortifications. Withdrawal will open up the road for the Russian forces to push towards the rear in the direction of Mykolaiv. Therefore, they are the final defensive line of the Ukrainians in between Kashyantinivka and the Druzhkivka Pokrovsk line. Speaking of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to advance north and west of Novoserahivka. They have managed to gain control over the area here in between Novoserahivka and Udashne, opening up the road to the south of Udashne, where the Russians can advance towards the town from two separate directions, leading to two supply lines being opened for the Russian forces to enter Udashne. In addition to two supply lines into it, there's also a third one here in between the eastern and western flanks, and there are several roads leading to these supply lines as well. This means the Russians would have several directions to enter Udashne from, which significantly improves the ability to supply the forces within the town and their offensive capabilities to gain control of it. Gain control of it will open up the road for the coal mine here to the west of Pokrovsk, where the Russians will look to gain control over that industrial area as well, leading to a defensive line being established on the western flank of Pokrovsk for offensive operations entering into the Dnipropetrovsk region. Speaking of the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians, with control over the remaining parts of Novoserahivka, has an additional road into Novomykolaivka and have reached the fortifications just west of the town. The Russians will here look to fight over these fortifications, gain control over them, securing their foothold in the area and into the Dnipropetrovsk region. Then they will redirect their forces to a push towards Muravka and then onwards towards Novopavlivka, where the Russians will be attacking from the northeast, southeast, and southern flanks. The Russians also made additional smaller advances here in the direction of Yalta, gaining a foothold in the eastern parts of the town as the Russians continued their offensive operations to gain control over the areas between the Mokryali River and the Lvovcha River line. To the southwest of this, the Russians continued offensive operations towards Shevchenko, gaining control over the first line and parts of the town in the northern parts of the river line. The Russians almost have full control over Shevchenko, following which the Russians will push onwards towards the fortifications, gaining control over those as well as they continue their push from the Fedorivka Vesele area. The Russians also managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Perobudova with a push across the river line. With this, the Russians have managed to gain control over the entirety of Fedorivka, Komar, and Perobudova along the river line here, the Mokryali River line, with additional pushes here in between the Mokryali River line and the Lvovcha River line. Carrying that flank will allow the Russians to continue offensive operations in the direction of Mirne, Pidopne, and through the rear of these fortified positions. The Russians will be looking to push towards Voskresenka and generally everything in between the Lvovcha River line and the current frontline positions. We're seeing that the Russians continue their offensive operations mainly focused around the Donetsk region, with the focus on the city of Kashyantinivka and Pokrovsk. Our offensive continues on the flanks of both of these cities for the operational encirclement of them. The Russian focus is currently to close the pocket here west of Toretsk, cut off the supply line between Druzhkivka and Pokrovsk, to gain control over both of the flanks of both of these cities, then to siege both of these cities to gain control over them, Both of these scenarios will allow the Russians to significantly bolster their offensive operations, moving further to the rear of the Donetsk region through the Slovyansk-Shensinivka line and into the Dnipropetrovsk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.